Hi, and welcome to the Long Range Shooting and Custom Rifle Building podcast presented by Wolf Precision Incorporated, where we learn about and share long range shooting and custom rifle building. I am your host, Jamie Dotson, and welcome to the show. Hi, and welcome to episode 86 of Wolf Precision's Long Range Shooting and Custom Rifle Building podcast. I'm your host, Jamie Dotson, and welcome back to the show. In this episode, we are going to continue on in our series where we're going to talk about the 4 pillars to build great fundamentals of marksmanship. And in this one, we're going to talk about a rifle setup. And we also have some pretty cool updates on the long-range shooting schools being announced for 2022. So without further ado, here we go. All right, before we get started, we would like to say a quick thanks to Wolf Precision. Wolf Precision is a proud sponsor of the show, makes the show possible. Where we build custom rifles and, of course, the home of the Ace. So you can stop over and see more about the Ace at wolfprecision.net. We'd also like to thank Krieger Barrels. Krieger is another proud sponsor of the show and home of fine cut rifled barrels. They offer a program called Krieger Direct where they have in-stock barrels ready to ship. So if you're in a hurry or you want a very fine quality cut rifled barrel, stop over to Krieger.com or KriegerDirect.com today and get yours in as little as 3 to 5 business days. All right, so in the previous podcast, I brought up this idea about talking about the 4 pillars of laying the foundation for the fundamentals of marksmanship. And in this episode, we're going to talk about pillar 1, and that's setup. And then the continuing episodes are going to continue on to the other 4 pillars where we're talking about preparing for the shot and firing the perfect shot and, of course, follow through. So there's going to be a 4-part series. This is the first one, and this is about the setup. And it has a little bit more to do than just, plopping the rifle down. And it's not talking about setting up the rifle from a build perspective. This is about setting up the rifle to shoot. The last long-range shooting school we had come through was a great example with people that had a huge amount of experience but didn't have knowledge. And so there is a huge difference between having knowledge and having experience. So, for example, I like to ride a motorcycle. I've had motorcycles pretty much my entire life. One of my passions is the BMW Boxer style GSs. We do a lot of 2-up riding. It's very comfortable. It's very much off-road capable and able to get to areas you normally couldn't take some motorcycles. But so just to give you a backstory on the difference between knowledge and experience, I always like to look back at some of the different things that I do and that maybe can relate to listeners out there. And one of them is riding a motorcycle. And so when you're riding a motorcycle, one of the things I think that's huge is there's a big difference between having knowledge and experience. For example, you can have 30 years experience, but only 1 year of knowledge. And you're just repeating that 30 times in a row. So even though you've been riding a motorcycle for 30 years, you've never got past that 1 year learning curve. So every year you just repeat what you've learned. You're not really growing and learning as a rider. And so yes, you have 30 years experience riding, but you really only have ever learned or accumulated 1 year of knowledge. You just repeated it every year. Put this into context. Several years ago, I was on my way back from down towards Baltimore, Maryland, back to Johnstown, Pennsylvania. Right around dusk, just got brand new tires on my motorcycle, and I'm coming around the turn. It's Route 30, which, by the way, for those that have ridden Route 30 or have ever driven the Lincoln Highway, it's a beautiful ride. So I was coming back from Chambersburg area up into Bedford, Breezewood. Beautiful ride, by the way. And as I was coming around the turn, a log, literally a log, rolled out across the road in front of me off of a trailer that should have been hauling a lawnmower. Instead, they had these long logs tied together with twine. And as they had come around the turn, they dropped the logs, and one of the logs rolled out across the road right at the exit of the turn. Well, you can have the experience in life to know that, hey, that's a log and I'm going to hit it. But having the knowledge to straighten the bike up, stand on the foot pegs, and roll the throttle, and as you're impacting the log, that's knowledge. Experience, coming around the turn and seeing a log, says, that's a log I'm going to wreck. Something bad's going to happen. and you're going to lock your brakes up. You're going to panic. Knowledge is knowing that when you go around that turn and you see that obstacle in the road, that you have to do everything right to get to the other side of that obstacle and hopefully on two wheels. And so knowing that you've got to stand up in your foot pegs and that just before impact, rather than hitting the brakes, you've got to roll the throttle on. And I cleared it. It was, oh gosh, I don't know. I don't know how round it was, but my guess is from edge to edge, it was might have been 12 to 15 inches. It was huge. It bent my front wheel. So BMWs are sort of unique that they have tubeless spoked tires. So I always got spoked wheels on my motorcycle. And the reason being is if we hit something hard or if we're off-roading, there's less chance of the aluminum wheel that's on a lot of these motorcycles from cracking or failing. So to have a catastrophic failure, I guess. So they'll bend, they'll move, they'll disform, and a lot of times even hold the bead of the tire. And so I hit the log so hard, it completely collapsed my suspension. So one of the things about BMW bikes, not that this is a BMW motorcycle sales pitch, but they have an almost like an automated suspension or it reads like in milliseconds as the bike's riding over things and keeps adapting the suspension for both collapsing and rebound. And what had happened was, in speaking to the insurance company and the reps afterwards, is that the bike had recognized the impact and allowed the suspension to completely collapse and bottom out. I bottomed out so hard on the log that it bruised the bottom of my feet through the city boots that I was riding. So I have off-road riding boots on, and the impact was so violent that the foot pegs that I was standing on actually bruised the bottom of my feet. That's how hard I hit. But the bike collapsed. The suspension, it pushed over. I cleared it. I probably looked like Evel Knievel coming off the other side. The guys were standing on the side of the road, their eyes as big as saucers, waiting for me to wreck the bike. I come down on two wheels. It didn't blow the tires, but it bent the front wheel. You could see the impact or the roundness of the log on the front wheel where it deformed the front wheel. And when I come down off the other side on two wheels, I started working the brakes, got off the side of the road, and of course said my prayers that A, my wife wasn't with me sitting on the back because she wouldn't have known to stand, and then, or there wouldn't have been time to, and that B, that I made it to the other side of that log in one piece. Now, the backstory to this, too, is that those guys ran out, pushed the log off the road, and left me broken down alongside the road. Rather than turning it in on their insurance or saying we had an accident or, yeah, we shouldn't have had all this log, they abandoned me on Route 30 in the middle of nowhere. And so I guess for this part, I was grateful that I was on the road, that had I wrecked and slid off the road, my mind went to, oh my God, would they have left me lay there alongside the road and died and just took off. So I made it across the log. And by the way, guys, I am not the greatest off-road rider on the planet. I am certainly not Evel Knievel. One of my friends once told me years ago, he said, when you're doing anything like this, especially with like motorcycles, is the big important thing is don't outrun your angels. And so I like to have fun on a motorcycle, of course, but I'm always very cautious that I don't push too hard, that I don't get myself in a situation that doesn't give me enough time to get myself out of it. And that was a perfect example. It was right at dusk. I was coming, thank God it was coming out of the turn. There's a really sharp turn before you start, probably 4 or 5 miles outside of Breezewood. And as I was coming around the turn, of course, my eyes aren't looking in front of the bike. My eyes are looking through the turn, and I see the log, and it's rolling across the road. And I was like, oh, my God. So the only thing I could do at that point was stand on impact, roll the throttle, and pray that I clear it. And the BMW GS bikes have a fair amount of ground clearance. I look sort of silly on it because I'm only 5'9", and I'm almost tippy-toeing. And thank God I had enough clearance that the log went underneath the bike as well and didn't catch. But that's a perfect example of having experience versus knowledge. And the same thing goes when you go into long-range shooting. And the reason I bring this up is, of course, the gentlemen that were in the very last long-range shooting class, they probably had more, quote-unquote, experience than me. They were certainly much older, and they had been hunting and shooting their entire lives. But where they lacked was just the simple knowledge. And so what the experience had taught them was to set their rifle up and to do all of these things, not knowing that the knowledge that they were basing it off of was wrong. And that how they were approaching it and the things that they were doing in the setup itself was actually as crucial as everything else when it comes to shooting the rifle. And so when you're laying that foundation or that pillar especially when we're talking about the first pillar and today, and that's talking about the setup of the rifle. You can be doing this wrong for 30 years and not even know you're doing it. So, for example, when we talk about fundamentals and we talk about how people's fingers springs off the trigger as soon as the trigger breaks, a lot of people don't know they're doing it. You don't really get the chance to watch yourself shoot very often, but at the school, it's sort of funny. We'll let students watch each other a while without saying much, and I'm just pointing things out, and they're like, oh my gosh, I can't believe I do that, or oh my gosh, that's crazy. Who does that? But it happens that quick, it ingrains itself, and you don't have the knowledge to correct it. So let's talk about the setup of the rifle, and this is really critical because improper setup of the rifle totally destroys everything that's the chain of events that happen from here on out. And so if you don't have a proper setup of the rifle, as you're going through your fundamentals of marksmanship, because of how the rifle is setting and being handled and on the rear bag and all these other things, negative stuff still comes out, even though you might be doing all of these other things after that right. So you're going through and you got good hand squeeze, cheek weld, cheek pressure, natural respiratory pause, you're straight, clean, pull of the trigger, and bang, the shot still misses the target or is really far off on the left edge. That's because of the setup. And so let's talk about properly setting up the rifle. And again, I'm not talking about setting up a custom rifle, building it, like how do you install the scope, how do you put your rings on, what you tighten your action. This isn't that type of setup. What I'm talking about is the rifle on the ground, getting ready to shoot before you even get on it. When shooters are having a bad day at the range, I oftentimes will tell them, stop shooting, get off the rifle and just look at your setup. Don't change anything. Don't touch anything. Don't move anything. Just get off the rifle just for a second and just do a visual around it, from the side, from the rear. Look to see if there's something silly happening, something touching, something that's not square or true, something that's pulling the rifle or dragging the rifle or acting like a false shoulder, influencing how the rifle is going to recoil. You'd be surprised on how many of these little things happen quickly and then just cause chaos and chaos and chaos. And eventually, what the funny part is the shooter will stay there and continue shooting at that target, missing all over the place. If they just sat up after the second shot and did a quick glance, and they would see that their bipod foot is hooked on something hard on the back side, and every time they're shooting, it's working like a second false shoulder and throwing your shot, you could have ended the misery right on the second shot. But instead, they insist that, I'm going to keep shooting and shoot again and shoot again and shoot again. And they do what I call sticking your head in the bucket. And I talked about the story of where I come up with that saying here at the school. If you'd like to ever hear the story of where I get it from, it's actually pretty comical. But they wind up sticking their head in the proverbial bucket, and that's where they stay. And it only gets worse from there. So let's talk about the setup here. When you're working with the setup itself, the big thing is you're trying to picture how the rifle is contacting the ground and what all can be influencing the shot from, let's just use prone as the example here, but this applies to shooting off a backpack, shooting off a roof simulator, all of these things. But the prone or the bench or that type of situation, let's talk about that and base it off of there, then keep applying this knowledge to the other positions as you have to shoot from them. But the first thing is to make sure that nothing or limit as many things as you can that are drag or catch points off the rifle and the stock itself. So I am a huge fan of like the old AICS chassis systems. They were really wide, much wider than the AIATs are today. They were very square. They were very smooth. They had, on the bottom and the sides, by the way, they had a locking point up front for either a bipod, which back in the old days was a Harris, or you get into the new ones with the Picatinny rail. But if you can picture the sides of the rifle and the bottom of the rifle like runways, they got to be smooth and clear of obstacles, because under recoil or jamming a rifle into a bag or against a tree or off your backpack, these little attachments that you put all over the place are basically catch points or speed bumps as the rifle either recoils or gets pushed into position, or if you're loading the rifle forward, they're actually grabbing and pulling on the rifle in different areas as well. And so right out of the gate, before we even talk about setting the rifle on the ground and preparing, is I actually like stocks that have very nice sides on it that are flat that I can jam up against a door frame or something that's solid and flat that's going to track. And I like a lot of room on the front of the stock for it to slide back and forth. One of the reasons I like the AIAT so much was because of how they were built. They were flat, but they weren't perfectly polished smooth either. The skins portions come down, and that's where the rifle would rest, but they had a little traction to them. So, for example, they weren't like an Arca rail that's baby smooth from front to back to where when you shoot, the rifle just slides like it's on a slip and slide. The other dangers with this is eliminating, of course, any junk that's hooked all over the rifle. That I always look at things as a priority as to what needs to be on the rifle and what does not need to be on the rifle. And there's lots of things that you can put all over your rifle everywhere. So, for example, like a new police officer, A, has the skinniest waist, and B, the most stuff on his belt that you can possibly imagine. I mean, A, he doesn't have the real estate to put it all on there, and B, he thinks he needs everything. But then you look at the cop that's got 35 years, of course, his belt's on the last hole now because it's been, of course, stretched out a little bit. He's got his holster on one side. He's got his radio holder on the other. He doesn't even use, a handcuffed holder anymore. The handcuffs are just slipped in his back. And I mean, he's got the most real estate now, but the very least amount of things. And the reason being is because he wants to be able to get to it efficiently, effectively, and he knows what's important in a priority situation. That he can get to the things that he needs to, but the things that are on him that are a huge priority, he wants to be able to get to them easily, quickly, and not try to carry everything that's going to catch on things. And, you're trying to get out of your car quickly and it catches on your seatbelt. I mean, you're struggling with somebody and all of a sudden you got stuff falling over everywhere. You chase somebody and they can practically follow you by the trail of debris that you leave behind of stuff bouncing out and falling out all over the place. So same thing with the rifle. Like, I don't like a lot of stuff hanging all over, and I hate, and let me put this to you maybe in a little bit more of a professional term, hate all of the like Picatinny rails that are all over the sides. I mean, I think of those things like cheese graters as your rifle's recoiling along the edge of a hard surface, as it's, you've got an area for places to catch and drag off those sharp edges that are along and just shank your shots or pull you off target. And so keep everything simple on the rifle. Pick out a stock that has a lot of nice real estate for the rifle to recoil freely without catching and dragging. As you push it back in the battery, it's not like tuk, 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 sliding over something. Or also that it's not so slippy that the rifle's just out there sliding around out of control all over the place, like a car with bald tires, Then when you're hooking everything up, we're talking about our setup here, make sure that the things that are on the bottom that you're going to use are tight. Not uncommon at all for customers who have brought rifles through the school to have a Picatinny rail to hook their Atlas bipod on to be loose. And so while they're shooting, the actual attachment point of the Picatinny rail is actually bouncing around or moving a little bit slightly. And then make sure if you're shooting off a bipod, which is what we do with here at the school, is make sure your bipod's tight and locked in properly. So make sure it's in the groove, make sure it's clamped on both sides, but then make sure it's tight. Also, make sure that if you get like a CAL or Atlas, the PSR, make sure that you have the CAL or the anti-cant, because we want to be able to level our guns. Make sure that that's got enough friction lock to keep the rifle from bouncing back and forth easily. So I like enough friction on the bipod when I'm leveling it that I can level it. It's a little stiff, but then when I work the bolt quickly, it doesn't tilt or twist the rifle. That's important. Then we go on to the back in the setup. Now here's where I think the biggest problem comes into play. I personally think the rear of the rifle is the steering wheel. It has the biggest impact on the muzzle. It's the furthest away, so a very small movement on the butt pad itself has a huge impact on where the muzzle points out front. Think of it that way. And the different bags that you use, you have to be really careful because I personally think the butt stock itself or the very rear of the rifle is the steering wheel. And if you don't know how to drive a rifle properly from back there, or if issues pop up in that area, it translates into errors that get multiplied. And so a little movement at the rear of the rifle has a big impact on the muzzle and where it's pointing to at distance. So be careful that A, I like, again, a very smooth transition area for the rifle to recoil and slide across the bag. So, for example, like the Macmillan A10, the Macmillan A5, A6, the Macmillan A3-5, they all have that butt hook per se, but they've got a nice smooth transition period in which your rifle can either ride across your hand or the bag and slide freely for a little ways while the bullet's exiting the barrel without catching and hooking on stuff. So when you see like tactical stocks with a very short area in the back to set the bag on, if it slips off the bag or it catches on the front edge or back edge, it's just not enough real estate to get a nice little pulse rearward without that coming off the bag and controlling it. Give yourself some room back there. And then also, when it comes to the rear bags, and we're going to do a video on this here shortly, is make sure that the bag is square to the rifle. Make sure that, like, for example, we use Doggone Good bags. They're like a 2x3x4. They're like a little block bag. And they have a flat edge. When you stand them up on the medium side, for example, they're about, maybe 3x4x5, so they would be 5 inches wide. So you've got this 3-inch high, 5-inch wide bag that's square underneath the rear of the rifle. Well, if you twist that, or you have a tendency with your left hand as you're squeezing the bag, because your left hand doesn't hook around and squeeze with the palm of your hand facing into your armpit, the nook or the area between your pointer finger and your thumb is usually at an angle facing your armpit, not running true with the rifle. So I like to keep my thumb and my pointer finger running straight and true with the sides of the rifle, pointed back to me. So picture my left hand holding the rear bag. It's bent around, and my pointer finger and my thumb are actually running straight and true to the sides of the stock. This is how we teach to shoot with bunny ears, and then this is how we train to teach with you shooting without them. So we either rest our hands on the bag or we put the rifle on the bag and squeeze the bag. But we have to make sure that bag is square to the butt of the rifle, because if not, under recoil, if the bag falls away, which sometimes it will actually pull the rifle left or right if it's twisted. And so it'll fall away to that straight edge, dragging your point of impact or the rifle with it ever so slightly. Same thing with bunny ears. We use the Protector bunny ears to train here at the school because we were pinching the ears onto the stock. We're letting the rifle slide through the ears, but it basically gives a little bit more control, or controlling the bounce left and right. So it's training you to how to shoot without it. It's not a handicap per se, because we'll shoot the same way without the bunny ears, except for now we're pinching the stock with our fingers rather than the ears. But it's a training tool to get you to feel how the rifle is supposed to track into your shoulder properly. But again, you have to make sure that bag is square. If it's twisted a little bit, as the rifle's recoiling, it's got more tension pushing on one side than the other. It can bounce back and forth between the bags. It's almost like ping-ponging between the ears rather than riding straight through them. And then the other thing is make sure the heel and the toe of the rifle is not dug into the bag itself. So you have to have the bag far enough to the rear that as it recoils, you got some real estate for it to slide to the rear. But you have to be careful that you don't have it so far to the rear that the toe or heel or the bottom of the butt pad is actually dug into an ear or into the bag itself, because you're pinching that in place. And now the rifle can't track it. There's a chance that the rifle's going to actually catch in that bag with the toe and sort of kick it up as it slides to the rear. So make sure that part is completely free of any contact with the actual bag itself. Now, before we continue on about the setup, I do want to say another quick thanks to a couple of our sponsors. They make this show possible. We take about 4 to 6 hours a week to work on this podcast, and of course, it's no charge to you. And one thing we would like to ask of the customers and to the listeners out there, if you enjoy the podcast, if you would share it, please, if you would post some nice comments, leave some nice reviews. We really appreciate that, and it does help us in our standings. But I do want to say a quick thanks to MDT. MDT is a proud sponsor of the show. They had donated 6 stocks on our stock wall for customers to come in and see. And so if you come in for our open house days where we're going to demo the ACE and we're going to show you how everything's installed, but the big thing is you come in and actually get your hands on a lot of these really neat stocks. So if you want a really cool tactical stock, by the way, they have their left hand orders open, so they have their left hand month, I guess, orders. So if you're left-handed or southpaw and you really want an MDT stock, stop on and get your order today. So thank you, MDT. You can stop over and see more at mdttac.com. That's mdttac.com. And we'd also like to thank Triggertech. They have been a sponsor of the show here since we started it, which we really, really appreciate. We use their triggers solely in our custom rifles. So great design, safe trigger, single screw adjustment. You hear me talk about it on all the different podcasts. But I really do enjoy the trigger, and they offer a lot of different variations in both pull weights, single stage, two stage, and for lots of different makes and models. Our rifles are Remington 700 clones, but they make triggers for other rifles too. So you want a great quality trigger in your rifle, stop over to Triggertech.com. That's Triggertech.com today. So the bag area is one of the areas that these shooters that had come through the shooting school last had really just big issues with because of the things that they have developed in bad habits. And it's not really your fault. I mean, you have to think about it. We get so concentrated on things that are in front of our eyes when we're shooting that I sort of always say that we go brain dead from the neck down. Our head forgets it's got a butt attached. And if it's not in front of our eyes, we fall asleep at the wheel. And so we have to have a way to come back and check this stuff. And that's where we'll get into the other parts of the foundations of the fundamentals of marksmanship. But for this one, we're still talking about the setup and how crucial this is. Now, let's continue on. Make sure that you don't have catch points all over the place, grabbing on your different bags. So, for example, we use bunny ears often and use those for training. But if you take a stock that has like these nuts or bolts all over the sides for adjustability, make sure they're not catching on an ear. Use a recess little nut to get in there so that you don't have that edge sticking out. Make sure that, when you're using a bag, you're using it properly. And we have some rules here when it comes to using a rear bag, especially for supporting for prone, is number one, never stack them, ever, ever, ever. I believe personally that it just makes you might as well just shoot off a Jenga. You just got stuff sliding around uncontrollably all over the place underneath the rear of the rifle. So number one is never stack bags. Number two, make sure that they're square and true to the rifle so that the rifle is tracking on it straight and that the bag isn't pulling it away. Number three, make sure the heel or toe isn't stuck somewhere on it. Number four is make sure that there's nothing on the sides of the stock that's going to catch. So, for example, you see some stocks now that have like a Picatinny rail that you can put on the bottom for like a rear, almost like a third foot that you can put down on it. AccuShot, I think, made it. But you have a Picatinny rail now on the back buttstock of the rifle that's catching and dragging on your bags. And so I want a nice smooth area. I don't want things with sharp edges or ledges to act like a cheese grater dropping out across my bag and catching and pulling. And then the other thing is your left hand, if you're a right-handed shooter, is going to be holding that rear bag and sort of driving the rifle. That's your steering wheel. So make sure that your left hand is back there. If you're a right-handed shooter, your left hand is holding the rear of the stock. Your right hand, of course, is your firing hand. And your left hand is almost like holding the steering wheel, I would say. So make sure that the rule here is that you're either the rifle's on the bag and you're pinching the bag, your hand is free and clear, not touching anywhere, or your hand is on the bag and the rifle is in that groove between your thumb and your pointer finger, aiming the rifle into your shoulder and then controlling the recoil left and right, guiding the rifle straight into your shoulder as it's recoiling. So your rifle is either on the bag, your hand is not touching it, your hand is now squeezing the bag, or your hand is resting on top of the bag and you're holding the rifle with your hand. So the rifle should be on the bag or on your hand, but never try to hold both the bag and the rifle at the same time. So if you picture like a smaller shooter bag where people will be holding the bottom half of the bag with their pinky finger, say, and then they've got the upper part they're sort of holding with their hand. So don't try to hold both of them together. You're either holding the bag or you're holding the rifle. The other thing that gets involved in this, and it's amazing that this keeps going, we're still talking about the setup of the rifle before we shoot, is make sure that your right hand and your left hand, they're close together. Make sure that they can't bump or that they're not resting on top of each other. So if you think about your right hand and left hand as you're getting ready to shoot, I want my left hand to be back really far to my shoulder, and I want my right hand more forward onto the stock. And you might have to adjust this with either adjustable length of pull or moving some things around. But very common, you'll see shooters shooting prone with almost their right hand holding the trigger and their left hand holding the bag, touching or almost touching. And so you've created like another false shoulder. Think about it. Your right hand is going to come back and bounce off your left hand holding the bag. And so you've now caused another issue or something else that the rifle has to deal with under recoil that isn't natural. And so make sure that your right hand and left hand are clear. Also, really, really important, is that make sure when you're holding the rear bag with your left hand is that you don't let that hand touch the stock anywhere. So if you're holding the bag, it's very common to see somebody holding the rear bag and then the rifle up forward the stock, buttstock a little bit further, is resting on top of their hand. And now the rifle has to deal with coming back and bouncing off that soft, meaty portion of your hand and sliding through that, as well as you pinching it in the bag. And so you've got to give the rifle a chance to do what it wants to do. It really does want to hit the target. Be honest, if it was on an automated system, it would probably hit the target every single time, right? And so these little things in your setup itself cause as much, if not more, heartache than the actual art of shooting. What's amazing is we're going to have a 30-minute plus podcast just talking about proper setup of the rifle. But it's just that important. And all of these little things really do matter. And this is what was causing these gentlemen so many issues as they were coming through the school. Some finer points that I think are really important to touch base on here that often go unspoken, especially when you start talking about hunting class rifles, is make sure that if your rifle has a sling stud, especially like the old style where you just hook it, it's got this button sticking down. I would personally try to get a stock without that, with a flush cup system, but you got to make sure that sling stud isn't on the bag or close to touching it or bumping off of it while you're shooting. Here at the school, when we used to allow students to bring their own rifles, we would make them remove that sling stud so that the rifle had something to track on that was smooth without a speed bump in the way. And then also make sure that if you're using a sling, like for example, my hunting rifle has flush cups and we put the flush cups on the side. The reason we use the flush cups is because we can simply push a button and we can pull the sling stud, I guess you would say, with the sling attached and just push it out of the way. So we can unhook it from the rifle, move it out of the way, and now we can use our rear bag properly without it catching on the sling or the sling stud or something else getting in the way, right? And so I'm a big fan of flush cups that we can actually just push the button, drop the stud and the sling out of the way if we get an opportunity to shoot an animal prone, especially for long-range shooting. Now, when you're holding the rear bag, this is a big one. You have to hold that pinch or how much pressure you're pinching on the bag through the entire shooting process. A lot of times shooters have a tendency as soon as the gun fires to relax their left hand. Now I'm talking about a right-handed shooter where the right hand is holding up with the grip of the stock and trigger and the left hand's holding the rear bag. But they'll have a tendency to drop the shot or relax their left hand as soon as the gun fires. So make sure, it's really important here that you hold the same pressure, maintain that pinch or whatever you're holding on that rear bag through your follow-through. Don't rest your left hand or the hand that's holding the bag. Don't let go. Don't loosen your grip. Hold that same grip through the shot. Another really important thing, and again, we're still talking about the rifle setup, is make sure that the back of your bipod feet aren't backed up against a very hard or sharp edge. A lot of times, especially with like the shooting mats that you see out there now, they're very firm and stiff. And so when you lay them out flat, if you try to pull your rifle back so your feet are off your mat, and by the way, another really important thing I talk about here at the school, make sure your bipod feet, even if you've got those cool little hooks you can slide your feet forward and put all this bipod pressure on them, I prefer my feet be on solid ground off of the mat. The mat can slip and slide. You get mats out there that are almost second to Certa Perfect Sleepers, which we'll talk about here in just a minute. The big danger here is that your feet are off the mat. And it's funny, like as shooters shoot, they let the rifle take them for a walk to the rear. So they shoot, the rifle recoils, they push the rifle slightly forward, they shoot again, the rifle recoils more, they push the rifle slightly forward. But what slowly happens is them and the rifle slowly start to work their way to the rear. And so the rifle keeps working its way backwards ever so slightly, and so does the shooter. And eventually your feet themselves are resting up against that very hard edge of your mat. And so you take some of these new shooting mats that are out there that when they're laying flat, they're like almost like folded, and they're very rigid. And so there's nothing like having another false shoulder against the back of your bipod while you're shooting. So now you've got it on your shoulder, you've got all these other grips and touches, but now your feet are hung up, not letting the rifle recoil naturally the way that it wants to do. So be sure that your feet are clear, your bipod feet, of the front or leading edge of any hard surface that it could back up against. That's really, really important. And then the other thing is just to, while we're talking about the mats, is we get a little grief here at the shooting school because the mats we use are very thin. The only reason we have them is to try to keep the shooters somewhat comfortable. But if you're really going to learn to shoot and you want to shoot well, you've got to have your rear bag as well as the rest of the rifle on a very hard, firm surface. So, for example, we had a chiropractor. His name's Dave. He's a great customer, good friend. He's been to the shooting school 15 times. I mean, the guy's awesome. But his shooting mat, because he had rib problems, was very thick. It was almost like a Serta Perfect Sleeper. It certainly wasn't a shooting mat. It was a mat that he used for shooting. And anytime he tried to use it, he shot terrible. Finally, it took, forever to convince him, just leave the mat out of it. Forget about the mat. Get down, shoot. We'll adopt some other ways that you can shoot to ease up some pressure on your ribs. But the rear bag was resting on this soft mat. It would be like trying to shoot off your mattress at home. Your rear bag is moving and bouncing on a soft surface, and it's not stable underneath the rear of the rifle. And again, that's the steering wheel. So personally, I think the buttstock of the rifle is the steering wheel. And if you got something loosey-goosey underneath there and the rifle is able to move around, especially as the recoil starts to push back on that, that's going to cause you all kinds of issues. So our shooting mats here are very thin. They're just designed to keep you dry, keep you out of the mud, sort of try to keep you clean a little bit. But they're very thin and they're designed to not have anything soft or mushy underneath the rear of the rifle. And certainly our feet don't belong on there, so our feet are out in front of the mat on solid ground. The last thing to touch base on here is, and we'll spend, at the shooting school here, the first day when we get into the fundamentals of marksmanship. So we go over all these things that the customers have to do right in order to shoot long range. But after lunch, I'll spend a good 30, 40, 50 minutes going over exactly what I'm doing right now before we go to the range. It is so important. Like, for example, remember when I said this last class, and I'm going to send some emails out and ask them if they would take pictures of their groups. The very first groups out of everybody in the class, the worst was like maybe 0.35, just under 0.4. But we had groups in the 1s and 2s for the first groups out of the gun at the opening bell of the class. So the first groups were firing for 0. They were killing it. And the reason was we took the time to address the setup after we talked about the fundamentals of marksmanship, because they can be great fundamentally, but if they don't take time to look at their setup and do that part properly, it inserts issues. And a lot of times that they're unfamiliar with. So again, the difference between having experience and having knowledge. We're giving them the knowledge here and taking a lot of time to do it. I'm literally saying, we may spend 30, 40, 50 minutes just talking about all of this stuff here because we know we're going to have to address it one at a time individually over and over again at the range, piece by piece as we see it and find it. So it's best to do it here to everybody in the class, piece by piece, go over the entire thing that we're talking about right now. And that way we avoid having to do it at the range on a one-on-one basis, basically rinse and repeating ourselves. Not only that, but then the other issues. There's so many things in this setup that they have to watch for. It's best just to go over it all at once. And it's worked. It's worked really, really well. So I hope this helps you. If you get into trouble at the range, look at your setup. Just get off the rifle. A couple shots aren't going well. Set back up. Look at your setup. How's it looking? Is something wrong? If you're in competition, the same thing applies to shooting in non-prone positions. So like when you're shooting off a roof simulator, when you're shooting off a rock, when you're shooting off your backpack, all of these things still apply. You have to be very careful on the setup because it can grab the rifle, pull the rifle, push the rifle, and it will put the bullet anywhere other than where you want it to go. And I think that's pretty important. If you enjoyed the podcast, please share it. It is one way to get the word out. We really appreciate you doing that. And also, we'd like to ask if you enjoyed the podcast, if you don't mind posting up some nice reviews or saying some nice kind words online. That really helps us in our ratings and to get found as well. So thank you so much for taking the time to join us here. My name is Jamie Dotson. I'm your host, and you're listening to the Long Range Shooting and Custom Rifle Building Podcast.